Hey, I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of Grace, Grit, and Grounds. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's have a conversation. In the last episode, we talked about human beings and how human beings are inherently meaning makers. How we step into each day clothed in identity, whether we realize it or not. We don't just get dressed; we prepare to be someone in the world every time that we get dressed and we prepare ourselves to step out of the house. But now we need to ask a harder question. I think one that most of us try not to linger on too long. And that question is this: what happens when the identity we construct cannot hold? Because if we're honest, most of us have experienced moments when the image we've carefully curated cracks, when the job title disappears, when the relationship ends, when the approval fades, when the body changes and the success that we have had starts to stall. The platform shrinks, the role that we built, uh, well, our sense of self around, well, it's taken away, or we fail at it, or we simply grow tired of carrying it. The mask slips and maybe even cracks a little bit. And suddenly the person we thought we were feels unstable, unfamiliar, maybe exposed. We scramble at that moment sometimes to rebuild, to redefine, to find something else sturdy enough to stand on. But even that's not good enough. Scripture tells us this instability is not accidental. It goes all the way back to the very beginning of time. In Genesis chapter 3, and we've talked a little bit about this already, the first human response to sin was not violence and chaos. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't, light things on fire. It was concealment. Adam and Eve realized that they were naked. They realized they were vulnerable. They realized that they were, well, they were wrong, and that's when they sewed the fig leaves together to cover themselves. They in essence were trying to hide from God. They were trying to manage the perception, right? They didn't have a PR company or a representative or anything like that. And even if they did, they still would have done it poorly because, well, we're humans and we, we think that we can manage these things, but in reality we can't. We just can't. But they attempted to construct a new identity that can survive the sudden awareness of shame and vulnerability. But their solution, like many of ours, was fragile. You see, leaves, well, they dry out, they tear, they can't really protect people. We've talked about that. They are a temporary fix for a permanent fracture. Then God asks that question that echoes throughout the rest of human history: where are you? Not because he doesn't know where their location is, not because he doesn't know our situation, but because he's inviting them to face their condition. What has happened to you? Where are you now? Where have you gone? Right? These are the questions that echo through those words as God was walking through the garden in that evening and he was seeking Adam and Eve to have fellowship with. The Bible is remarkably honest about the human condition, and that's important. It's one thing I love about scripture is that it doesn't color things in a positive light for us. It gives us the straight, unvarnished truth, what uh, some of my favorite theologians would say is true truth, the real truth, not color coded, not, made to order to make us feel better about where we are. It simply tells us who we are. It doesn't flatter us, it doesn't despise us either, and that's something to think about too. Even though scripture is clear and true and gives us a good accurate picture of who we are, it doesn't despise us. God doesn't despise us. The Bible tells us that something inside us is bent. The prophet Jeremiah writes about this. He says the heart of mankind is deceitfully wicked, desperately sick above all things. It doesn't mean that we are incapable of goodness or beauty or love. It just means that our internal compass doesn't reliably point to true north. We can be sincere and still be wrong, passionate and still be misdirected, confident and still be lost. Augustine captured this phrase in Latin when he says, incurvatus in se. It's, again, a Latin term, and it literally means that the soul is curved in on itself. Humanity turned away from God and became self-referential. We became both the subject and the standard of judgment. You see what I'm saying? Even when we try to do good, we often do it for mixed reasons. Even when we seek truth, we filter it through pride, fear, wounds, desire, trauma, all that stuff. Our perception is real, it's just not pure. We're looking through a lens that's been cracked, a little bent. Everything we see carries that distortion with it, almost as though we walk through a world of funhouse mirrors that's constantly giving us distorted images back to ourselves. This kind of explains why self made identity is so fragile. We're building with tools that are themselves damaged. We interpret the world through a distorted lens so that the identity that we construct from that inspiration will always be a slight bit distorted. We may build something impressive, even admirable to those around us, but it won't be stable and it cannot bear the ultimate weight of history because ultimately we build on fragile things. Paul describes this dynamic in Romans chapter 1 as an exchange. Humanity trades the glory of God for substitutes, not because we stopped worshiping, far from it, but because we've redirected that worship towards things that cannot sustain us. We look for ultimate meaning in achievement, relationship, respect, status, pleasure, ideology, tribe, or sometimes and more often than not, control. None of these things in and of themselves is inherently evil, but they become destructive when they are asked to answer the question only God can answer. And that question is, who am I really? When those substitutes fail, we feel exposed again. The old shame sort of leaks out through the cracks in our mask. Modern culture tends to amplify the process because we have an unprecedented freedom to curate how we appear, more so than we've ever had, I think, in the history of mankind. We can shape our public persona through, well, everything, through clothing, social media, career, identity, lifestyle branding, political alignment, aesthetic choices, endless forms of self expression. We can reinvent ourselves repeatedly over and over and over again. At first glance, this seems like a liberation. It seems like, well, it's a form of freedom, but I don't think it is. I think it's a trap because it often produces anxiety instead of peace because the responsibility for defining ourselves never ends. I see this all the time, and I'm not trying to pick on my wife because we're all like this. I do the same thing she does. I just don't go through the same process she does. But almost every time that we have a big important event, she will go through 3, 4, 5, 6 outfits before she chooses the right one. I was talking to a church member the other day, and they said basically the same thing. We were guys and we're commiserating, in a funny way. This is what guys do when we get together, we talk, and I had mentioned this aspect about, some of the quirky things that my wife does and how the outfit that she starts off with is likely and often not the one she ends up with. And my friend said the same thing that it's funny, that the outfit you can almost guarantee the outfit that they put on first is never going to be chosen. And it's funny. We joke about it, but it's also a sad thing because I guess it's playing out in real time that understanding that when we are responsible for defining ourselves, it never ends well, and we will go through an endless cycle of trying to curate how the world sees us and never really do an adequate job. Often what we present to the world reveals what we feel we are lacking. If we feel invisible, we may seek attention at any cost. If we feel powerless, we may try to project dominance or aggression in our clothing and our attitude and our stance. If we feel unloved, we may often chase approval or perform constantly in front of people. If we feel uncertain, we may cling to rigid labels or identities that promise stability. This is where legalism comes in. This is where the Pharisees were. If we feel unsafe, we may build walls of distance fueled by irony and maybe even indifference. But the truth is, we feel unsafe. These are not merely social behaviors, they are spiritual hunger expressed sideways. They are attempts to solve an internal problem with external tools. The tragedy is that validation from other people can soothe us temporarily, but they can never really stabilize us permanently. Human approval fluctuates, it goes up and down. We see this in social media, what's trending, what's not. Cultural standards shift. We've seen that just sometimes a matter of hours, right? What is praised one second is mocked the next. Even our own self-perception changes with mood, fatigue, comparison, or circumstance. We become dependent on feedback loops that we can't fully control. Scripture points us to a different foundation. Instead of constructing identity from outside in, we are invited to receive identity from the inside out, grounded in God's declaration rather than public opinion. Not because other people do not matter, but because they cannot carry the weight of defining us. James uses the image of a mirror to describe what happens when we encounter truth but do not internalize it. We see ourselves briefly and then walk away and forget what we look like without a stable reference point. Self knowledge dissolves quickly. We revert to whatever narrative is loudest at the moment and whatever makes us feel the best at that second. Whatever voice may have been most recent, whatever fear feels the most urgent. Jesus tells a similar story about building on a rock versus building on sand. Both houses may look solid for a short time. Both may appear well constructed. The difference is revealed only when the pressure comes: wind, rain, flood, time. One stands out, one collapses. The issue is not effort, it's foundation, right? This is why curated identity eventually cracks. It's built on shifting ground. It depends on conditions remaining favorable. It requires constant maintenance. It cannot absorb shock without fracturing. None of this means appearance, clothing, or presentation is meaningless. They are expressions, and expressions do matter, but expressions are only as stable as the identity beneath them. A uniform can signal authority. We've talked about that, but it cannot create character. A brand can signal success, but it cannot produce security. A persona can attract attention, but it cannot generate peace. If the foundation is insecure, the presentation will consistently and constantly need reinforcement, more attention, more approval, more proof that we matter, more reassurance that we are still acceptable, valuable, and worthy, still seen, right? But if identity is grounded in God, presentation becomes communication rather than compensation. We are not dressing to convince the world we are someone. We are dressing as somebody who already knows. The energy shifts away from performance and moves into presence, from anxiety to steadiness, from self-protection to availability. The Christian story does not say stop caring about identity. It says you were never meant to invent it alone. The deepest human need is not to be impressive or even understood by everyone. It is to be known and secure at its core. As we flesh out this series, we're going to continue to look at what this means. We are moving continually in this direction of what I've been calling theological anthropology, the study of mankind in light of God, right? We will explore furthermore in coming episodes, what it means to receive identity instead of manufacturing it, and why Scripture speaks so often about being clothed by God Himself. Because from Genesis to Revelation, the story of redemption is not only about forgiveness, it's about restoration, it's about revelation, it's about being covered, named, and established in a way that doesn't depend upon our performance or our personality. Because the deepest human need is not to be admired, but to be secure. Not just to be seen as powerful, but to be safe. Not to prove that we matter, but to know that we already do, and that our intrinsic worth is built on something beyond ourselves, on someone who did far more than we ever could, on Jesus Christ, who went to the cross for us, who has given us the ability to clothe ourselves with His righteousness, not our own. And that kind of identity cannot be curated. It has to be given from Jesus to ourselves. I know I'm dealing with powerful concepts, and I'm hoping that something I've said resonates with you. And if you're liking the direction of this, this mini series that we're looking at, this idea of theological anthropology, as we dive into identity and what it means to be human in light of God, I encourage you to maybe like and subscribe. Hit the little bell button down below to give yourself a signal and to send a message when we have another episode coming out. I'm going to try to put out a few more episodes back to back rather than spacing them out like I've been doing, because I do feel like this message matters. Like what we're talking about means something. And so if you've gotten something out of this that is tangible, if you're liking the direction, like, subscribe, follow this channel, and we look forward to having this conversation with you again. And I am very grateful that you've chosen to spend a little bit of time with me today on Grace, Grit, and Grounds. I encourage you to come back often and hear more of this conversation. Go ahead and drop a comment in the comment section if you have something you want to share. I do try to get back to these comments as often as possible because I think that this conversation needs to be two-way, not one way. As always, I'd like to encourage you simply by saying that grace builds what grit sustains. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, keep the coffee warm and the conversation flowing until we see each other again.